Hello and welcome to E-Pathshala lecture series for MArch students. In this module of planting design, we should continue to see a few aspects of the visual composition of plants as such. In this module, we would see certain kinds of the aspects of visual composition, the principles of visual composition, and understand some of the principles in continuation with what we saw earlier, like harmony and contrast and balance, which we saw as principles here. And here in this particular module, we will see about a few other principles of visual composition, like emphasis, bringing in emphasis and accent, as well as sequence, and also understanding scale also as a principle in the visual composition of plants as such. We saw earlier that visual composition could be regarded as a visual grammar of planting design, and painting, photography, sculpture and other visual art forms can be analyzed by composition, and some principles are all common to all. So, as we see that a lot of these kind of principles are very common in all these in terms like balance or harmony. It could also play a very significant and important role in a particular kind of visual art, like photography or even painting as such. So, there are a lot of principles that are very common to each other, and here in context we would see how these kind of principles can be very effectively brought in into the planting design as such, and how we could bring about a very effectual and highly refreshing designed environment by bringing in these principles into force, and also using them in a very right and in a very constructive manner. And so, there is see a lot of similarities, we would see a lot of overlaps, we would see a lot of common ideas that are applicable to various differences. So, and this is what Nick Robinson has done in his book Planting Design Handbook, where he lists different kinds of visual principles of visual composition, like harmony and contrast and balance and emphasis, sequence and scale. So, how to give emphasis and how to arrange the different elements that are there in the visual composition, and and how do we look at scale also as a part of the entire visual composition, and bring different types of visual landscapes, different kinds of expression of the designed landscape itself. So, in contemporary context, we have a lot of different landscapes that are actually we call them as a wow landscape. So, in which scale is being used in a very different manner, and sometimes very interestingly, so that it captures the attention of the user immediately, and the entire designed visual expression seems to immediately attract one towards itself. So, the lot of these characters can be brought together in a similar way, and one can bring them together. So, an understanding of all these kind of principles and all these kind of characters, how do we use these visual characteristics, in what way, and using what kind of arrangement, and how do we place, what comes in the foreground, what comes in the background, what comes on the left or what comes to the right, and what expresses itself as big, what expresses itself as small, how does the gradation express itself from the smallest to the biggest. And all these when we take planting as such, it is not only the planting medium, it not only necessarily have to be only the planting medium, but how it goes along and gives a unified sense of visual composition with respect to the built environment also. So, these are different ways in which we could identify, and one thing that planting design gives us is a rich and a very diverse material or a palette, I would say, so that one could bring about all these kind of different kinds of characters together, and in unison, in harmony, At the same time, one could enjoy the differences, and so that everything works together as one, everything expresses themselves as one, with a certain sense of contrast, as a welcome contrast, as one should say, and one can really enjoy the differences as such, which also brings in us the interesting factor in all these kinds of visual compositions. So, in this particular module we would go further and see about a few of these principles of visual composition. First thing is emphasis, emphasis and accent. So, as the word suggests, there are many things and places can be emphasized by associating them with planting of a special character. This is often called accent planting. It can be used to draw attention to elements like entrances, steps, seating or water. So, as we can understand that in a planting designed environment, not all the places deserve a certain sense of attention. There might be some areas in a planting environment or in a built the planting design which is done around a built environment, which need to be screened off, which should be very unseemly to look at. So, in these kind of cases, one should be able to bring in a certain kind of emphasis, bring in a certain kind of attention towards another area, towards a different area, so that the attention is being drawn out from one place and the attention is being focused on to another, and this is being done by using by giving emphasis to a particular direction, emphasis to a particular point, or even emphasis to a particular element as such within the environment as such in which one is designing. As we read here, this is often called as accent planting. So, that we accentuate a particular place which suddenly helps me to divert from one area visual line to another line, and something which brings in which it takes my attention and focuses itself onto it. So, it draws attention to elements like entrances, steps, seating or water. Sometimes the planting itself provides the focus of a space, and accent planting is essential for the creation of a visual rhythm and the division of the full extent into comprehensible sections. So, it is not only necessarily involves emphasis or accent, not only involves any kind of hardscape, like it not only have to be a doorpost or a sculpture, or in many cases it could be a clump of trees, it could be a very sculptural tree which sits in a very beautiful base of low height ground covers, or a nice flower bed for example. So, these kind of planting itself can become the focus of a space, and accent planting is very essential in this case, that you create that kind of visual rhythm, and at the same time what emphasis also does is to bring in a sense of division within the comprehensible sections of the designed landscape itself. So, one is able to identify what is the important part of this landscape, what is the important area to be focused in this landscape, and what isn't, and what might be the secondary space. So, it brings in a certain sense of importance, a certain gives importance to the individual spaces within to one of the individual spaces within a lot of multiple spaces that could be seen in a particular design landscape as such. So, it is very important to understand. So, emphasis and accent planting can be effective by virtue of its intrinsic striking qualities, or by careful arrangement and grouping which brings the eye to rest at the chosen location. So, what happens here in terms of emphasis is that we try to give in a character that is very important, we bring in to give a character that actually tries to grab a person's attention. It could be a very strong color, or it could be a very strong form, like a very like a sword shaped leaf or something. Sometimes the palm has a very striking quality, it has a sculptural form in itself, which is completely different to the other kind of plant forms that are expressed visually, maybe in contrast to the oval upright form, or even the round form, or the dome form. So, the palm form is something that is very different. So, what happens is that it immediately brings in a certain it stands out by means of its quality, and also by arranging them as a group, it suddenly gives you a sudden difference in the visual landscape. So, the intrinsic striking qualities are being carefully arranged, and the grouping is being done, so that the focus of the eye is being brought to that particular location. So, I hope that this is very clear in terms of what we are looking at, like giving a particular importance or an emphasis to a place, and accentuating the importance of the design landscape in this particular area. So, it is closely related to contrast, because any strong contrast or sudden change of appearance will attract attention. So, as we keep moving through a particular place, there is a sudden contrast which comes in. So, when we trying to do an emphasis or accentuate, so we bring in a certain degree of contrast. So, there is something that one sees that is not normal or not the usual in a particular design environment, and that is when somebody starts to try to explore as to what it is, and what could be this. So, and thereby the emphasis is being given to that particular area. So, this is very important. So, this sudden contrast or this change that brings about, it brings in a certain kind of attention, and the change of appearance brings in a certain kind of interest that would make someone to look into a particular planting design composition, and see how what is so different. So, thereby we try to bring in a certain sense of attention to all these things. So, a single plant or form contrasting with its setting will create a accent, and will create an accent. So, it will create the emphasis. So, you can use and even a single plant in a particular area, and it can have a very striking form, and that could really bring in that kind of emphasis, and try to grab the attention. As we saw in certain visual characters like form, there are the coarse textures. The coarse textures tend to they are very striking qualities of plants, and one could be able to look at them or identify and appreciate their textures even from a larger distance. And suddenly, when as one moves closer, the scale becomes bigger, and suddenly they become attention grabbers and attention seekers as such, because the human eye suddenly perceives the contrast, suddenly sees the scale in the planted environment, and starts to look at what could be done in this particular aspect as such. Secondly, we see sequence. So, sequence is the way that the visuals of planting composition changes or unfolds before the observer. So, sequence is a way in which it is like more like a scene, or it is akin to a movie. What happens next? What do one see next? At what angle does one see it? At what eye level does one see it? And everywhere there is a change in terms of the way something is being perceived. There are different ways in which perceived, and when there is a sense of movement that is being brought into the design landscape, one could start to see as a progression of different scenes as such. So, sequence is the way in which the visuals or the scenes are being brought or being changed, and it how that each scene unfolds before the observer. So, as you can see, it is very contextual to how a particular observer looks at that particular scene as such. So, sequence may be visible from one observation point, as in a buildup of colors, textures or forms within a single vista, or it may be experienced as a progression of scenes that unfold as we move through the landscape. So, it could be a sequence like when one person is stationary. At the same time, it could be a sequence that actually evolves or expresses itself as one moves through. As one stands in a point and starts to look at a particular scene as such, how does he see? The first he starts to see the green, the color, that leaves as such, and suddenly he starts to appreciate the flowers and the overall form, and also the context in which that plant is being placed, and the overall surrounding. So, So there is, everyone does not observe everything at the same point. So there is a progression of observation, and while and one can achieve this certain sense of sequence by bringing in that the order of observation in a very interesting manner, so that one can appreciate the design landscape as such. Or else in the other way, in the other hand, it can be a progression of scenes, how the entire scene pans out before the eye of the observers as one starts to move along this particular area. So as I move, what changes? Suddenly the area looks big, and suddenly I go through a narrow lane where these proportions are very different to the human angle as such. So these things become very important. Sequence is essential to the dynamic qualities of composition. It involves an element of change. So there is always an element of change, something keeps changing as one keeps moving, and the perception of this change makes it a very interesting experience, and thereby it makes somebody to move along, it can make somebody to stop, it can make somebody to take a look at something, and it could be very interesting, where one can create an emphasis point and in any part of the design landscape, and bring in a certain sense of attention into a particular point, as well as interestingly open out a design landscape. Maybe it could be it could be surprisingly brought out, and so that a wow factor is being created, that suddenly a very beautiful or a very stunning imagery is being panned out before your eyes, so that it immediately makes a picture within you, and you remember it for the rest of your life as such. So it gives us a single picture of the design landscape by relating all the different parts together in a timed manner. So over a period of time, over as one progresses, or one keeps moving and one keeps seeing at different angles, and something opens out. So finally it all comes as a single picture, so that the experience of that particular user is elaborated, or one could explain, like this is how this entire visual was expressed as such. So came out, or this visual was shown to us in this kind of a sequence. So it's a very interesting way in which one can look at it. So it is, as I said, it is one particular character or a principle that can be even seen in other qualities, just like music, where there is a standard composition, but there is a way in which a particular instrument is being highlighted by coming from the lowest grounds to the highest grounds, and how the sequence might end with a drum beat. So there are a lot of different ways in which one could see it, and this looking at music, or understanding music, one would be able to understand how this kind of principles can also be brought into the planted medium as such, and how one could appreciate the change as well as remember everything together as a single entity or a single component, just like a song, as it has a different parts, as a song has different parts, as an instrumental, or an interlude, or the ending sequence, everywhere it one remembers it as a song. So in the same way, the planted landscape also could be brought, where everything can be ordered simply. They could be given accent points at different areas, or it could be overlapping, or there could be a certain sense of repetition that is also being brought into the design landscape as such. So you could see here as the principles of visual composition, like its sequence, like how do we move, like how does one see as one travels, like what do I see when at point A, that I would see the trees spanning out, and as one moves through the entire landscape, then you see the whole trees, suddenly you are in the midst of two particular this avenue, where the trees start to overbear the highway, and become very strong elements, and makes the space more narrower, and suddenly one moves through, and suddenly the entire the right hand side starts to open out into a huge field, and that is how there is a sequence that is there, and there is a way in which the open space or the meadows are being opened out, first from concealment to an area where openness is being brought out into the entire landscape as such. And this is how sequence comes in terms of progression, the opening out of scenes from one point to another, and also it is being brought out in a very timed manner. Here we could see the sequence that is being brought in terms of a stationary point, where if one could see this picture, how one could see there is a foreground of plants, and then you have a sequence of lower ground level plants, and you have a coarser texture, then you have the taller ones, and in all these in all these stand the tall stems as such. You could see the taller structures, trees coming out. So it is also a sequence in terms of a visual which could be looked from a very stationary point as such. So the way in which all these things expresses themselves are very important, and each of them can be worked out very carefully. Another important visual composition is scale. In simpler terms, scale can be considered as a size in relation to another size. It is a relative term. So scale means how we relate one to another, and it's a relative term, and as a size in relation to another size. So that's how simply we can understand scale as such, and that's how we try to bring in planting scales as such. In planting design, generic scale refers to the size relationship between the various parts of a whole space and within a planting composition. The relative sizes of single plants and of plant groupings determine the generic scale of the composition. So planting as such, and the groupings of plants, the individual plants are being brought out in multiple quantities together. They are formed as one group, and they are being brought together with another plant group which could completely be at a different scale of a different height as such, and they could be brought together in one particular entity. As you can see, there is a grouping which is very close to the water, the more like the grass variety that is there, and that is how you could see, and suddenly the scale starts to increase with the larger plants, the larger shrubs, the taller shrubs which comes, and also the smaller trees, medium height trees, and right as the landscape progresses, it also goes to the higher level of trees as such. So the relative size of single plants and of plant groupings determine the generic scale of the composition. So how what kind of plants do I use, and what scale of plants, and how do I relate? There is, in the earlier picture, one could see a very gradual gradation, gradation of the scale of the plants from the lowest to the highest as such. So human scale refers to the relationship between the size of planting composition and the person seeing the design landscape when one is designing for the people. So one, because one is designing for the people, so human scale becomes a very determining factor in terms of the planting composition itself, and based on this, the scale and the scale of the entire space is being monitored, and it is brought into focus. So one must take account of the human scale relationship of landscape and allow for the effects of different patterns of relating with the environment. So it becomes the human becomes a very important component as such, because the usage is end user is human, and based on a normal scale comparison, this is being brought out into much into a degree of very important uh, effectiveness, or effectiveness is brought into the design by relating everything to the human scale. So the amount of detail that we can perceive depends on the distance from which we perceive a particular composition or object. In such cases, as distance increases, so we would see less detail, but a greater area, and although the content of our view changes, the amount of information that we can assimilate stays about the same. So we could see, as one keeps closer, one could identify the trees, the colors, the differences, the patterns, the textures, but one as starts to recede and looks at a larger landscape, there is less detail that one starts to look at in this particular context as such. So as one starts to stand very closer, you could see the finer characteristics of foliage, textures, everything starts to look at. So why I am saying that, how the human starts to perceive it. at distances. So, at a distance of 25 meters, these details will be barely visible. One cannot feel the textural qualities of the leaves. So, it looks as a single color, and the texture becomes very dominating, and one could see just a very finer texture as one starts to recede back. So, if we move back to 100 meters, only the trees will be appreciated. We can only see the scale and the individuals and the smaller plants of the combined mass. So, the human perception of a particular design landscape becomes very important, and scale is completely everything he starts to relate as to how he sees it and how closer he sees it as such. But also not only on distance, but also on movement and how fast one could move within a particular design landscape, and this becomes very important, and the amount of information that can be absorbed. So, how does one see a particular space in terms of scale as one moves in a boat, the speed of a boat or a speed of a car. So, how the planting space scale also should reflect the observer's speed of movement as such. So, planting should be repeatedly seen from a fixed vantage point and studied at leisure, and this will do the justice to a smaller scale and greater diversity than planting that will receive only brief glances from a moving vehicle. So, something which is stationary has a lot of detail, and it requires more appreciation from the eye of the user as to how that particular aspect is being seen as such. So, speed is also a very important factor in as to how something is being looked at. Like for example, the trees, how do you start to look at one at the distance? As you keep moving closer, you could see the two different patterns, the trees, and you could only see the tree form that is very prominent. As you move closer, you could see the tree form, and the lower base starts to express, and once as we start to go very closer, the finer textures and the detailings of the tree, the bark, the structures starts to express itself much better. So, viewing distance and scales, how at what scale do we see, how do we see at a longer distance, as we keep moving closer from one point to another becomes very important, and how things evolve, how do I look at spaces as I start moving from here next over closer to the avenue, and finally right there in the avenue. So, the sequence and the movement, all these are user perceived, and how it exposes itself in the eye of the user could be very interesting, and emphasis and accents can be brought in by using colors and textures and various elements as such. So, these things are different ways in which one can bring in a lot of different qualities into the landscape by using the right kind of visual characters and bringing in the right kind of principles and putting in it in perspective as such. The having studying the visual character of plants, visual composition becomes the language of expression of the planted medium. So, we need to use them rightly in terms of the quality, in terms of the quantity, as also place them in the right way positionally also. You can identify a sequence, add a dynamic interest in that sequence by giving right kind of emphasis to a particular area, give right kind of highlights in the visuals by providing suitable accents, and also understanding viewing distance, the speed of movement, and how one can work out the scale as to how the human will perceive that particular space. It is very important, and also the detailing one could see from a particular area as such. So, it's the visual characters are given to us, but what brings us a refreshing design is how we put in these principles into practice in the design landscape itself. So, it's these principles that enables us to give us a very good planting design altogether. Thank you.